This segment will review new sources of labor in the 18th century American colonies and the colonial economy's focus on acquiring, producing, and exporting commodities that were valued in Europe. 18th century America saw the development of a small class of professionals. Men in these fields typically received some kind of training or education. Most honored were Christian ministers. Initially, college education was reserved only for men, for the men of the cloth, meaning ministers. While still highly respected, ministers and priests of the 18th century did not carry the same social influence that their Puritan predecessors did in the century before. On the other hand, doctors and lawyers were not as esteemed as they are today. It was not until 1765 that the first medical school was established in Europe. Medicine was a trade, like carpentry, that was learned as an apprenticeship. Oftentimes, the remedies practiced by doctors were more dangerous than the illness itself. Bloodletting, for example, was a common remedy for infection, and when a doctor wasn't available, the local barber would be sufficient. Lawyers, too, were considered to be a rough and contemptible breed. In British legal matters, a person typically represented themselves, so traditionalists viewed lawyers as opportunistic and unscrupulous. Most hardworking American farmers found it difficult to trust someone who didn't work with their hands for a living. Early Connecticut law even classified lawyers with disdain as drunkards and brothel keepers. But as we've discussed, the overwhelming majority of Americans relied on farming for sustenance and income. 90% of the population were employed as farmers during the 18th century. The type of farming depended largely on the region. Rice was a major export for the Carolinas, as tobacco was for the Chesapeake colonies. Even the middle colonies had begun to export grain. By 1759, New York alone was exporting 80,000 barrels of flour each year. Though farming in New England was mostly for local sustenance, New Englanders found prosperity by other means. Fishing became a major industry there as New Englanders met the needs of Catholic Europeans for fish. Fishing also stimulated the northern colonies' shipbuilding and timber industries. Most important to New England's economy was its control over colonial trade. Merchants from the harbors of Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, provisioned the Caribbean islands with food and forest products, hauled Spanish gold, wine, and oranges to London, and brought African slaves and English manufactured goods to the British North American colonies. Early European explorers were awed by the enormous schools of cod on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. Fish were so numerous that they sometimes impeded the progress of sailing vessels. By the 18th century, New Englanders were aggressively exploiting the apparently limitless Grand Banks fishery, drying and salting huge catches for export to Europe and the West Indies. Some 3 centuries later, the accumulated predation of generations has so depleted the once fabulous Grand Bank cod population that the industry is nearly over. Here in this picture, you can see the salting and drying of codfish down here on these tables, as well as a busy wharf where fish are being hauled in and fish are being caught. This is a colonial map that demonstrates economic influence. By the 18th century, the various colonial regions had distinct economic identities. The northern colonies grew grain and raised cattle, harvested timber and fish, and built ships. The Chesapeake colonies and North Carolina were still heavily dependent on tobacco, whereas the southernmost colonies grew mostly rice and indigo. Cotton, so important to the southern economy in the 19th century, had not yet emerged as a major crop. Most of the wealth produced in the colonies was generated by the production of raw goods. However, the routes New England merchants ran hauling raw materials from North America to Europe, European manufactured goods across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and then returning to the mainland colonies with a little bit of everything, including African slaves, created a triangular trade system that became extremely profitable. Manufacturing in America lagged behind that of the mother country for several reasons. First of all, skilled craftspeople in the colonies were rare. So rare, in fact, that a Virginian carpenter was pardoned for murdering his wife because his skills were so desperately needed. Even more rare than skilled craftspeople was the access to infrastructure needed to manufacture finished goods. Blueprints for textile factories were a tightly guarded secret of the British Kingdom, and iron forges were few and far between. There were some exceptions to the rule, however. Some Americans were able to make money off manufacturing specialty goods, like rum, perhaps the most important manufacturing activity in the original 13 colonies was New England's lumbering and shipbuilding industries. By 1770, about one-third of Britain's merchant ships were being built in America, and nearly all the masts for the king's naval ships were cut from the tall trees of New England. Future President John Adams noted about the time uh, Future President John Adams noted about the time of the 1770s that commerce of the West Indies is part of the American system of commerce. They can neither do without us nor we without them. The Creator has placed us upon this globe in such a situation that we have occasion for one another. At this time, prior to the American Revolution, the most important colonies to Great Britain would have been the West Indies colonies. While the populations and economies of the American colonies continued to balloon, England's slower growing population hit a saturation point for American materials in the early 1730s. For American entrepreneurs, their success would depend on exporting to other European nations like France, the Netherlands, and Spain. For example, the bulk of American tobacco was going to France by the eve of the American Revolution. The Crown didn't mind the colonies selling goods to foreign nations, especially when the revenue was used to buy British goods. But it did begin interfering with colonial trade when its imports competed with goods the empire produced domestically. In 1733, Parliament responded to complaints made by the British West Indian planters against the American colonies for importing sugar and molasses produced by French colonies. The response was harsh. They passed the Molasses Act. This trade law placed a heavy tax on foreign sugar and molasses imported into the American colonies. The law would have dealt a crippling blow to the economy of New England, whose merchants and rum industries had become dependent on French sugar, as well as it would have hampered the lifestyle of colonists that had developed a sweet tooth. Ultimately, though, the impact of this legislation was curbed by rampant smuggling and insufficient enforcement. It is important to note that the conflict and controversy generated by the Molasses Act would foreshadow the conflicts that would spur the American Revolution. Americans would see the passage of laws like this as evidence of England's tyranny, and England would see the colonies' refusal to abide by them as a clear sign of their disloyalty. Commercial activity was strongest wherever water routes were best. Because of a lack of public funds and workers, the colonies were slow to invest in roadways. Major cities were not connected by roads until the mid-1700s. Even the best highways were strewn with stumps, rocks, and ruts, so travel by land was incredibly slow. Ben Franklin's 300-mile journey from Boston to Philadelphia took 9 days, and a month would pass before news of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia would reach Charleston. Because of how slow travel and transportation was in the 18th century, taverns sprang up in towns along the main routes to service the needs of traveling merchants. Taverns also became community gathering spots and political centers. Gossip and public opinion was formulated in the village tavern, and places like the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston became instrumental in mounting agitation and resistance during the American Revolution. Other institutions, like an intercolonial postal system, also developed in the 18th century, improved lines of communications. As primitive as they were when they began, these institutions would ultimately tie the people of the American colonies closer together. This is the sign of the Pine Tree Inn, created roughly around 1768. Inns like Joseph Reed's Tavern not only provided food, drink, and shelter and entertainment for colonial Americans, but also were raucous arenas for debating political issues. This sign, with its circular yellow orb or sun over a pine tree, may have been intended as a veiled reference to the Sons of Liberty, an extra-legal resistance organization that had adopted as its symbol the Liberty Tree. The date of 1768 coincided with the British enactment of the Townshend Acts, which ignited a new wave of colonial resistance to British rule. We'll learn more about that in the next period.